Good morning, everybody. How's everyone feeling today? Exciting. Come on, you can do better than that. Yeah, let's get excited. This is community. So, this panel is going to be pretty interesting. I think it's going to give us a chance to think a little bit about what happens before Executive Order 9066, right? Oftentimes, when we talk about the story of camp, we sort of start with Pearl Harbor. We talk about sometimes custodial detention index. But the reality is, there were decades of anti-Japanese racism that preceded any of this. And the important reality that I hope people will take away from this session is that we need to be vigilant when we see these kinds of things happening in contemporary communities and also our own. So, through the different lenses that myself and my two colleagues here are going to share this morning, I think we're going to get to those topics in some slightly different ways, and I'm excited about that. So in terms of the session, what we're going to do is we'll start with individual presentations. Each of us are going to speak for about 20 minutes. We'll come back together, the three of us, to sort of reflect on each other's presentations. And then we're going to open it up to the audience and hopefully have a really engaging discussion and question answer with the rest of you. So, I guess I could read bios for my co-panelists here. I'll start with Greg, since he's going to be up after me. Greg Robinson is a specialist in ethnic studies and U.S. political history. He's a professor of history at University of Quebec in Montreal. He's authored several books on the confinement of Japanese Americans, including By Order of the President, FDR and the Internment of Japanese Americans, and A Tragedy of Democracy, Japanese Confinement in North America. He also writes for the San Francisco Nichibei Weekly and the blog Discover Nikkei. He will be talking about pre-war origins of incarceration. And my second panelist is Eric Muller. Eric is the Dan K. Moore Distinguished Professor in Jurisprudence and Ethnic Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. He's an award-winning teacher and internationally recognized expert on the removal and imprisonment of people of Japanese ancestry in the United States from 1942 to 1946. His most recent book on the wartime incarceration is Lawyer, Jailer, Ally, Foe: Complicity and Conscience in America's World War II Concentration Camps. And Eric's talk is titled Evasions. So looking forward to that. But again, through these three talks, we're going to hopefully give somewhat of a timeline, looking at the chronology in a little different way. I'm going to be starting with a talk that is actually related to cultural racism and its impact on anti-Japanese propaganda. And, I think a lot of us are aware of the Yellow Peril, right? And the impact that it had on our Chinese American brothers and sisters. But we have to think about, how many of the parallels are actually directly related to the same narratives that the government and the culture and the society used against Japanese Americans. It didn't start with this sort of fear of enemy aliens and espionage and sabotage. It's not something that began even in the late 1930s. This is something that we can trace back as early as the mid-century of the 1800s. So I hope through this kind of talk, we're going to see some of these parallels, and specifically looking at some of the visual aspects, visual culture. So for a little bit of context, I teach at the University of Pennsylvania's Asian American Studies program. I do courses on Asian American activism and Asian American cinema. And most of my work in the first part of my decade, the first decade of this career, was about celebrating Asian Americans, the stories of triumph and our histories, through the Asian American Film Festival that I organized in Philadelphia. But when Trump came to office the first time, we started to hear words like alternative facts and fake news. And it was sort of in that moment that I realized, having grown up on the East Coast as a mixed-race Japanese American, I'm not surprised when people don't believe our history, but I felt the need to have hard evidence, hard proof. So I started to collect ephemera. I started collecting anti-Japanese propaganda, and from there went into the Yellow Peril, Chinese exclusion era, and have since expanded to a collection of over 200 pieces of propaganda and anti-Asian racism that actually spans all the way to post 9/11 Islamophobia. And so, it seems kind of counterintuitive to someone who celebrates our culture and our communities and is about empowerment to kind of be collecting this. But I'll just share a brief anecdote. The first time that I ever saw an anti-Japanese piece of propaganda in person, it was in 2017. It was shortly after they started this narrative around fake news and alternative facts. I went to an antique show in Center City, Philadelphia, where I live. And the first thing that I saw that greeted me across the room was a work poster that said, "Factory fires help the Japs." And it was a flaming face of an enemy Japanese soldier. And seeing that in person felt like a punch to the gut. It was something that, after spending, 15, 20 years doing academic research, having grown up as the descendant of folks that were forcibly removed, these are things that are part and parcel of my experience, of my history. But it still had this tremendous impact. And I thought, what would it be like to take this into a classroom and to show my undergraduate college students something like this? So I bought it on the spot, and that was sort of the start of this collection. So that's a little bit of the sort of history that gives you a context on why it is that I collect these things. Again, some of the images are uncomfortable to look at, but it's part of our history. So I hope you will understand the context that I'm showing some of these images in. So I'd like to start by referencing Edward Said. If you're not familiar, Palestinian-American scholar, really one of the founders of post-colonial studies. And his defining text, Orientalism, is a really important aspect of a lot of the research that we do in Asian American studies. Obviously, a lot of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with it. But in this very specific context, I want to think about the role that images and words and narratives have within the broader context of propaganda. Said's central point in Orientalism is looking at how the West positions itself as superior to the East and really all other formerly colonized peoples. And the way that it does this culturally, through cultural racism, is by creating this dichotomy of the superior and the inferior and using literature and images to create cultural racism that persists through every segment of our society. And when you have those sort of pervasive cultural attitudes, it becomes easier then to push policy that is going to be prejudicial towards communities like our own. So that's sort of the context that I want to share this in, and this idea that the West is constantly defining itself in relation to the East through these negative stereotypes. The very first element of Chinese Americans in popular culture in the United States, the first popular culture character that was known by name to most Americans was Ah Sin. He comes from a poem written by Bret Harte in 1870, who was a satirical poet, called The Heathen Chinese. The poem was originally titled Plain Language by Truthful James, and it was meant to be sort of a parable to point out the hypocrisy of American racism. It's about two miners who are playing a game of cards, and they're planning to cheat the Chinese coolie laborer out of his money. Towards the end of the card game, a bunch of aides fall out of Ah Sin's sleeve, and they realize that he was cheating them, and it basically insinuates that they go on and lynch the man. So in this parable, allegedly Hart was trying to poke fun at American racism and the hypocrisy, but his editor changed the title to Heathen Chinese. So when you have a title like that and a message like this, accompanied by images like these, it's pretty easy for that to become misinterpreted and for that to become what it has. It's portraying the sort of vice, it's portraying immorality, it's portraying the sneakiness. And again, these are some of the narratives that we're going to see that go straight through the wartime for Japanese Americans. But the popularity of Ah Sin cannot be understated. This was a poem that was published and syndicated in at least 300 publications nationwide in the 1870s. So this was pretty universally known at a time period when most Americans had never met a Chinese person or an Asian person in real life. So these are the kinds of images we're seeing. So popular that Mark Twain actually co-authored a stage adaptation of this. And so it's called The Heathen Chinese and Ah Sin on Stage. And this is a quote that he gave during the first night of the production in Washington, D.C. I'll just pull out an excerpt here. I think that the portrayal of this character reaches perfection. The whole purpose is to afford an opportunity for the illustration of the character the Chinaman is going to become a frequent spectacle all over America and a difficult political problem too. So he's talking about Charles Parslow, which is this man here. Doesn't look Chinese, does he, right? Because he's not. He's in yellowface. But these are the kinds of images that we're seeing of Chinese Americans at this time period. We're also then being bombarded by these anti-Chinese stereotypical political cartoons under the veneer of political satire. But in reality, these are very deeply harmful, violent images that are portraying Chinese as a violent pest and a menace to our society, as the sort of ruin to polite Western society and the oncoming horde of immigration. So we're going to keep seeing this kind of theme recurrent throughout the next several slides. I want to kind of draw your attention to a couple of cartoonists. This is a work by Peter Keller, who was a satirical cartoonist working for the San Francisco Illustrated Wasp in the 1870s and early 1880s, immediately before the Chinese Exclusion Act. And again, in the context of this publication, this was viewed as political satire, but the damage is done, right? And you see these kinds of narratives that are in the editorial and the political rhetoric of the time mixed with images like these. And it gives a pretty clear-cut message that the Chinese are unwanted as immigrants to this country. Here's another image by Thomas Nast, who was a very famous political cartoonist of the era. It's showing the martyrdom of St. Crispin, who was the patron saint of labor. And we could see this man standing behind him with a sword that says cheap labor, and behind him is another man that his sword says chopsticks. And then again, this is another one by Keller, where we can kind of see this narrative about Chinese immigrants coming here to take our jobs, quote unquote, right? So pretty familiar narratives even in the 20th century that I think most of us are pretty familiar with. It just is rinse, recycle, repeat. You can take one name of an immigrant group and replace it with another, and this is more or less the same till today. So as the years go on and we get closer to 1882, Chinese exclusion, we have more of the political rhetoric, the Chinese must go. And that's really because of the California Working Men's Party. There's this history of white labor movements in the United States being pretty white supremacist and anti-immigrant, and this is the epitome of it. Ironic because Dennis Kearney himself was an Irish immigrant, and yet he's the man who coins the phrase, "the Chinese must go." If you read some of the transcripts of his speeches, it sounds just like a campaign speech from Trump, honestly. You just replace the word Chinese with Mexican or another community, and it reads almost verbatim for some of the things that he said on the campaign trail and in office. But ultimately, when you have the kind of confluence of the cultural racism, political rhetoric, and then later editorial journalists, these are in Harper's Weekly. This is like a mainstream publication, one of the most widely read at that time period. I just draw your attention to, in the midst of this, the very first sentence, "The Chinese immigrates but does not assimilate." So this idea that Chinese and other Asian immigrants are an inassimilable other and therefore should not be welcomed into this country. On the other side, we have an advertisement showing which hotels refuse to employ Chinese. And so, for the quote-unquote good Americans, we're meant to go and support these businesses. And ultimately, as we see the Chinese Exclusion Act being accepted into law in 1882, there's even advertising that gets involved. The magic washer, laundry detergent, celluloid cuffs and collars, shirt starch, basically capitalizing on anti-Chinese racism to sell their products. If you want to get rid of the Chinese immigrant who's mostly employed in laundry, buy our products so that the Chinese must go. So ultimately, we know this sort of history. I won't belabor the legislation that follows it, but it's really cause and effect. And if you kind of look at the way that cultural racism leads to anti-Chinese exclusion laws, it follows the similar roadmap for what we then see with the Japanese Americans. In the first half of the 20th century, in the first decade after the exclusion of Chinese, we see the need for continued Asian immigrant labor. There aren't enough Europeans or white Americans coming to the West to build infrastructure, to work the farms, to build railroads, to mine. So they need to get labor capital contracts and bring folks in from Asia And at first, they're being welcomed, but very quickly, the same kind of white labor elements and then white nativism and white supremacists begin to take on this narrative that the Japanese are just as bad as the Chinese. Again, it's a little hard to see here, but in the top here of the brown men are most dangerous. To those who've not forgotten the nature and extent of the Chinese invasion when it threatened to obliterate Caucasian standards of living and foist an Asiatic civilization upon California, no more alarming can be made than the fact that Japanese is taking the place of the Chinese. This is from 1908. This is very early in the timeline, right? So if you think about how many of our grandparents, parents, great-grandparents immigrated at this time period, were living in this country, it gives a little character to what they were dealing with at that time period. And we know also how this enacted legislation between the Gentleman's Agreement, which forbids single bachelor men from immigrating to be laborers, to the California alien land laws, which are then enacted by Washington and Oregon a decade or a few years later. And it kind of comes from culture again. So in the same way that I talked about some of the cultural reference points in the Chinese American community, let me now do the same for Japanese Americans. How many people know Sesshu Hayakawa? All right, good amount of people for this crowd. I'm not that surprised, but for those who don't, Hayakawa was the first Asian American Hollywood star. He was the closest thing to a male sex symbol in Hollywood in the 1910s before Rudolph Valentino. So in the same way that Rudy Valentino was the dangerous, forbidden Latin lover, Hayakawa was the dangerous Japanese lover. And he was a handsome guy, and he was actually cast opposite of white women in many of his most famous films. However, being the racial politic that they were, all of these films end in tragedy, usually with some form of violence being enacted by Hayakawa as a sexual predator. In this case, he's branding this woman with a branding iron after she tries to leave him and stop having an affair with him. But, these are the kinds of narratives. So this is a 1915 film, the same year that Birth of a Nation came out. It's also the very first film that shows an interracial kiss on screen between an Asian man and a white woman, which happens earlier in the film before he then brands her and calls her his property. So ultimately, the kinds of narratives that they're saying here is that being in an interracial coupling is dangerous, that it will end in tragedy or violence, and that this is a cautionary tale of why you should not involve yourself with such people. But it's also continuing some of the same narratives that we saw with the Chinese Americans being violent towards white women, specifically. I've got a number of images from Native Sons of the Golden West newsletter, and it's a newsletter that was active from the early 20th century well into the time of the forced removal. But I think it's interesting to look at the 1920s specifically, because again, this is 2 decades before we see the exclusion orders coming out, and already they start to talk about Japanese as pests, as an unwanted peaceful invasion. So I don't have that much time, so I won't go into great detail, but I'm happy to provide these slides to anyone who's interested. I'll just pull out a couple of quotes here. They talk about, in this last sentence, the sentiment of the people of Los Angeles County, one of the worst Jap-infested counties of the state, is almost unanimous in favor to stop the peaceful invasion, the yellow man's peaceful invasion. So that's this idea of the invasion or the oncoming hordes. In another article from another 1920 paper by the Native Sons of the Golden West, who at this era certainly account for a hate group, but were also a powerful political entity in many ways. We see, again, the sort of belaboring of the growing population of Japanese in the United States, continuing to use this word peaceful invasion in the lower part of this paragraph. I found this passage interesting from a 1921 newspaper. It talks about the need to determine who's eligible to immigrate to the country. Every nation determines for itself what peoples it can assimilate to advantage for its future best interests. So again, this is the same kind of rhetoric that we were talking about in the Chinese exclusion when they're calling Chinese alien others. This has now been brought into the conversation around Japanese immigrants as well. I think this particular title is quite damning. And we kind of see, I guess some of the text came out from the transfer. But essentially what this article is about is a Nisei woman who marries a Japanese-American man, and they're basically lauding her for choosing to marry someone of her own race, but then also arguing that she's essentially Japanese just because she chose to marry another Japanese-American. So this idea, though, of Japanese ancestry being a crime, and the evidence of guilt and suspicion in both sort of the pre-war custodial detention index as well as the later rounding up of our immigrant leaders and the Alien Enemies Act, and even the executive order and exclusion. So these kind of continue on with this narrative structure around the peaceful invasion. We're missing some of the text here, so I'll just skip to the next one, because this is actually an advertisement for a sitting governor of California. And you can see right there, he has unswervingly taken a fearless stand against Japanese invasion. And I think the missing text there says, preserving for perpetuity generations of the white race. Vote for Governor Stevens. Culturally, we see some speculative fiction. This is from 1936, talking about Japan. They literally just put an L instead of a J, and it's an entire novel about how Japan is going to betray the United States and bomb us. This is a chewing gum card, Gum Inc. from Philadelphia, my hometown. And this is a series that was released after the Second Sino-Japanese War begins, basically showing war atrocities of the Imperial Japanese Army. I'll just pull up a couple specifically here. The bombing of Chongqing and the destruction of an American flag aboard one of the sailing vessels on the Yangtze River. In 1938, the publishers of Esquire launch a new magazine to be more political. It's called Ken Magazine, short-lived. It has some of the worst anti-Japanese propaganda that I've seen of this era. You can see from the title story, Underhanded Underground Japan. And this is the pull-out quote that they look at, specifically talking about the potential threat of basically bringing Japan's naval front 3,000 miles closer to us, taking advantage to sink 25% of our fleet. Interesting that this is 1938 because they actually did call this correctly. But still, the racism that persists and follows it is deeply troubling. This is another article from the next issue talking about espionage in Panama by Japanese, Italian, and Germans. So as we talk about Crystal City tomorrow, some of this stuff might come up again. But ultimately, we know how this part of the story goes, and I just want to end by talking a little bit briefly about some of the wartime propaganda. So all of these narratives that we're seeing from both the Chinese immigrant community as well as Japanese immigrants are then contributing to the wholesale acceptance of these narratives by the American public following Pearl Harbor, that Japanese Americans are complicit in this attack. We see a lot of propaganda that I'm sure people are more familiar with that really makes that connection point between what has happened and the populations of Japanese living in the West Coast. I don't have time to kind of talk about these in great detail, but I did just want to share a couple of the parallels. When we see anti-Japanese propaganda during the wartime, the ultimate purpose is to dehumanize Japanese so that it becomes a little easier for the American soldier to pull the trigger and kill people, right? I mean, that's the ultimate reason that we have propaganda in times of war. But I just wanted to end by kind of looking at some of these parallels. This is an 1882 Victorian-era trade card showing Ah Sin having his pigtail run through a laundry wringer by Dennis Kearney. And in 1942, General Hideki Tojo having himself drawn through a wringer by an American soldier. Here we have the magic washer that we saw earlier and countless images of Uncle Sam committing acts of violence on Japanese people. And ultimately, some of the narratives that we see of Hayakawa and others as sexual predators are easily recycled into these campaigns, talking about sexual violence on the home front should the Japanese invade. So ultimately, this is not where it ends. This is just the beginning of the story. But given the focus of this morning's panel, I just wanted to give you a little more context on how cultural racism contributes to anti-Asian propaganda. And I hope that you found this to be useful as we continue to have these conversations about other aspects of the pre-war incarceration. Thank you. And at this point, I'd like to welcome Greg Robinson to the stage to give the next part of our talk.
I wanted to talk particularly about the pre-war years. You know, people often speak about the mass confinement of Japanese Americans as a state of exception, they call it, meaning, you know, something that fell into the cracks of legal and constitutional authority in times of war. Now, it's certainly true that if there had been no state of emergency created by the U.S. involvement in World War II and its entry after Pearl Harbor, it surely would not have been possible for the federal government to remove an entire population from a portion of the country on racial grounds and to place its members in remote camps. All the same, looking at the pre-war period, it seems to me evident in hindsight that mass confinement was a logical conclusion of that. That is, it was an action that was largely waiting to happen by the time of Pearl Harbor and had become almost natural by the time it was actually put into effect. So what do I mean by this? Well, there are several factors that make it so. First, as Rob started to suggest, beginning in the pre-war years, the United States was definitely anti-Japanese, and amid growing tensions between the United States and Japan, and the U.S. government made repeated preparations for actions against Japanese Americans, people, ethnic Japanese in the United States. As early as 1936, officers from the Office of Naval Operations engaged in large-scale surveillance of Japanese communities on the West Coast and in Hawaii, and they were later joined both by FBI agents and even by private spies secretly employed directly by President Franklin Roosevelt. Even when these agents declared that Japanese Americans were overwhelmingly loyal, official efforts continued. In 1936, as is known, Roosevelt himself recommended that lists be made of potentially dangerous aliens and citizens of Japanese ancestry to be placed in a concentration camp in case of trouble between the United States and Japan. He received word that Japanese in Hawaii were greeting Japanese ships, and he proposed that a list be made of such people to be placed in a concentration camp in case of trouble between the United States and Japan. He also approved a secret ban, although one that was not always enforced, on Nisei working at military bases in Hawaii. Army planners, for their part, drew up successive plans for large-scale confinement of ethnic Japanese, and during 1941, the War Department and the Justice Department built a network of what officials publicly termed concentration camps. I mean, this was not a euphemism at the time. You know, in the days before the Holocaust, concentration camp meant a place where people were concentrated together. It was not a pleasant place, but it didn't have the inhuman elements, but they used the word concentration camp officially. For example, in November 1941, 1 month before Pearl Harbor, the Los Angeles reported that in tandem with an interview of Attorney General Francis Biddle, that the government had devised plans for segregation of alien groups if relations between the United States and Japan broke off. And Biddle himself explained that the United States had finished building these concentration camps. And it was indicated, it's quoted, "This might include government protection of the Japanese area here, numbering about 150,000 Japanese by the Army and Navy." And again, no distinction made between aliens and citizens, no distinction at all made about who might be liable to be sent to a concentration camp. Now, I should emphasize, there were no formal or precise plan made before Pearl Harbor for a wartime roundup of all ethnic Japanese. That's something that happens after Pearl Harbor. Nonetheless, all these actions created a momentum and an expectation. You know, the money put in, the plans provided. So all of this such that drastic action afterward became not only thinkable, but logical. And it provided Army chiefs on the West Coast after Pearl Harbor a springboard from which to press for mass removal, first of aliens, and then of the region's entire Japanese population, on the grounds of eliminating risks to security, and also, not incidentally, removing freedom of action, limits on freedom of action of the military in the region. Throughout the pre-war period, government officials were ready to believe the worst about Japanese Americans and to act on it without proof of disloyalty and in the face of contrary evidence. Of course, we know after Pearl Harbor that it was in view of this that General DeWitt, the Western Defense Commander, on being confronted with the actual absence of any actual fifth column activity by Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, could assert that the lack of such activity did not indicate that Japanese Americans were innocent, but rather that there was a conspiracy in the making. So in addition to the military and government preparations, there was a climate of anti-Japanese hostility and racism all along the West Coast. Now, of course, Rob has talked about the earlier background of anti-Japanese racism, but throughout the 1930s, that kind of bigotry created a climate of opinion for fake news, for alternative facts about Japanese Americans. Throughout the 1930s, respected individuals made wild charges about Japanese American spying and fifth column activities, which they persisted in even after the stories had been refuted. And of course, I can't help but think of J.D. Vance and the rumors about the Haitian communities in Ohio in thinking about this. U.S. Congressman John Dockweiler, for example, in 1935, made the absurd announcement that 1/4 of Japanese Americans in California were Japanese Army Reserve officers ready to take up arms at a moment's notice. Lael T. Kane, an officer of the American Legion, told a House committee that Japanese fishing boats could be easily transformed once in international waters into torpedo boats for the Japanese Navy. Stories spread that there was a Japanese fishing fleet of 120 boats operating out of California harbors using ships constructed in Japan and manned by 2,000 trained Japanese naval officers disguised as fishermen, ready to be converted at a moment's notice. Figure that, that the entire fleet of people trying to make their livelihoods was accused without foundation of being actually military torpedo boats for the Japanese Navy. Journalist Kerry McWilliams investigated the charges and in fact found that only 2 fishing boats owned by Japanese Americans were even bigger than 115 feet and only 10 more in the 85 to 100-foot range. It nevertheless continued to be reported. In 1940, a former FBI agent, Blaney Matthews, charged that Issei truck farmers were spraying their crops with arsenic to poison white consumers. Even after it was refuted, the celebrated evangelist Amy Semple McPherson lobbied publicly for the government to ban Japanese American farmers on grounds of potential poisoning. Even after FBI inquiries demonstrated that the charges were fabricated, the stories continued to spread. So Pearl Harbor then, of course, provided a heaven-sent opportunity for white, native, and commercial groups to get rid of their long-despised Japanese neighbors. We know about the West Coast Defense Command pushing the War Department chiefs, though they might be primarily responsible for fomenting mass removal, they were responding to widespread pressure from political and economic groups and to a lesser extent, popular opinion. Certainly, Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy, the chief operational officer responsible for forging and implementing Executive Order 9066, thought that civilian pressures, both before and after Pearl Harbor, were decisive. When his superior, Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson, sent him a memo in July 1942 asking about why Japanese internees, he called it, were so well treated, McCloy's response was, well, we weren't treating them so well. In any case, it contained a rare and revealing handwritten postscript. These people are not internees. They are under no suspicion for the most part and were moved largely because we felt we could not control our own white citizens in California. Finally, even before Pearl Harbor, there was international action, some of it coordinated, against ethnic Japanese throughout the Pacific Rim of North America and Asia and Australia. As in the United States, legislation and official action against citizens and aliens of Japanese ancestry began in the pre-war years. In British Columbia, for example, where practically all Japanese Canadians lived, the same kind of social prejudice existed against them, and legal discrimination was even more stringent than south of the border. Among 22,000 people of Japanese ancestry, irrespective of citizenship, were barred from voting rights, while the number of fishing licenses awarded to Japanese Canadians was more and more restricted. In 1940, after Canada went to war against Germany and Italy, the draft was reinstated in Canada, but Japanese Canadian citizens were excluded from the draft at the behest of British Columbia politicians who claimed that citizens would have an irresistible call for the voting rights if they were subjected to conscription. Instead, all adults of Japanese ancestry, including citizens, were obliged to register as aliens with the government. Persecution became equally marked in Latin American nations. In 1937, ethnic Japanese farmers in Mexicali, Mexico, right near the border, U.S. border, were displaced from their farms, and 10,000 acres of land owned by Japanese farmers were seized without compensation by the government. In Peru, pogroms broke out in the capital city of Lima in May 1940, and Japanese-owned businesses were pillaged. Once news spread of the Pearl Harbor raid, a massive reaction against ethnic Japanese swept across international borders. Australia, which had banned virtually all Japanese immigration since the turn of the century, rounded up virtually its entire Japanese population in the days that followed, and also received and interned the ethnic Japanese residents of New Zealand and French New Caledonia. A network of concentration camps was built, including Loveday in Australia. Latin American countries also took action. Japanese male residents of Costa Rica and Cuba were placed in confinement following those nations' declarations of war on Japan. In Panama, as a result of a pre-war agreement between the U.S. State Department and the Republic of Panama, joint teams of U.S. and Panamanian authorities went in and rounded up all the 1,000 ethnic Japanese in Panama, both in the Republic of Panama and in the U.S.-operated Canal Zone, and brought them into confinement in the Canal Zone. In Mexico, which did not declare war on Japan until May 1942, nevertheless, as far as beginning in January 1942, some 5,000 ethnic Japanese residents living in Baja California and Colima were expelled from the region and forced to use their own resources to migrate east, mostly into Guadalajara and Mexico City. With such belongings they could transport, the rest were lost. And in Canada, as you may know, British Columbia whites used the Pearl Harbor attack as a pretext for action, even though Canadian military leaders discounted any threat to national security by Japanese Canadians. Intensive lobbying by West Coast newspapers, public opinion, and MPs led to Canada's federal government adopting an order in council in January 14th, 1942, fully a month before Executive Order 906, which barred all adult Japanese men, both Issei and Nisei, from the nation's west coast and sent them for forced labor in road-building camps. Though Canadian leaders may have considered this a sensible compromise, West Coast activists used it as a pretext for demanding the mass removal of the entire West Coast Japanese population, which occurred following an order in council on February 24th, 1942. The history of the Japanese-Canadian incarceration is a long and difficult one to discuss, but it's a moving and instructive parallel to that which happened in the United States. So in sum, given all these factors, including government officials primed for mistrust, entrenched opposition to Japanese Americans among influential Pacific Coast political and economic leaders up and down the continent, and an international movement for mass exclusion already in swing, it seems in retrospect that mass removal and confinement of Japanese Americans was all but ordained by the time of Executive Order 9066. At the very least, it would have taken extraordinary faith in the Constitution for a President of the United States to ignore the pressure for mass removal and military control of Japanese Americans, for which President Roosevelt was not prepared to stand up. I would say it's even plausible to suggest, although evidence is lacking on either side, that in the face of such widespread outcry from the West Coast, with the potential for racial unrest and disruption of all important production and transportation to the West Coast for deliveries to the Pacific Theater, The president might well have concluded logically under this, in quotes, that giving the military a free hand to deal with 112,000 Japanese Americans he didn't really consider as full citizens anyway, was a simpler and less drastic move than declaring martial law and policing the area, as was done in Hawaii. Such harsh calculus might be considered logical under the circumstances, but it put the official seal of approval on a costly and undemocratic policy that not only mocked the pretensions of the Allies to be engaging in a war for freedom, but was itself self-defeating. As Mary said, it was unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, uneconomic, unjust, and let's say it sabotaged the war effort. Because unlike the Japanese community in Hawaii, which was preserved from mass incarceration and reacted by demonstrating conspicuous patriotism, a significant fraction of mainland Japanese Americans on the West Coast were alienated and scarred by their experience, and their contribution to the war effort, which otherwise would have been model, was thereby stifled. Thank you for listening.
All right, that leaves me. I'm Eric Muller, and I wanted to join my fellow panelists in expressing gratitude to you for coming out for this event, to the Takahashi Family Foundation for its support of the event. I also wanted to make sure to note that the most important page in your program that you received, you may not have looked at it yet, I want to make sure that you look at page 18, because page 18 is a celebration of Chizu, exclamation point. She and her energy, her indomitable energy over the years, of course, but especially recently, has been a driving force behind this kind of event. So I wanted to start actually with just by mentioning a conversation I had with my cousin yesterday. So I have two first cousins, and they both live in the Bay Area. My wife and I spent yesterday with my cousin Martha, and she was asking me a little bit about today and what this conference was about. And then she asked what the conference was called. I think that what followed was really revealing about the current moment that we're in politically. And I said to Martha that it's called Changing Perspectives on Japanese American Incarceration. And she blanched, and she leaned forward and said, "We still think it was really bad, right?" And I said, yes. We do. But her reaction, I thought, was so revealing. She wasn't joking. She, I think, was revealing the sense of the changing nature of the narrative about our own history that we are living through and that's in some ways being forced upon us. So yes, it was bad. And in some ways, I think my presentation this morning is to remind us not just that it was bad, that it was bad in ways that we don't necessarily even yet fully understand or appreciate. So this is in some ways a nod towards tomorrow's final panel, where we talk about what lies ahead, what remains to be studied, what remains to be examined, what directions and trends do we see and should we be pursuing. So I call this evasions, or more simply, lying to courts about invasions, and I call it the 1942 and the 2025 editions, because I'm going to tell you a story mostly about courts in the 1940s in the United States, but I will end with a link to literally the current moment that I think you'll find meaningful and perhaps chilling. I'm going to be talking to you about the lesser known of the two Supreme Court cases from that time period. The well-known case, of course, is Fred Korematsu's case, Korematsu versus United States, in which in 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. But sort of in the shadow of the Korematsu case is a case from a year earlier. This room will be familiar with it, but most are not. And that's Hirabayashi versus United States, which was Gordon Hirabayashi's challenge to chiefly to the curfew that was imposed pursuant to Executive Order 9066. He also challenged removal, but the Supreme Court decided to shove that one off onto the Korematsu case. So we understand the Hirabayashi case as being the one in which the Supreme Court approved the racial curfew against people of Japanese ancestry, including American citizens of Japanese ancestry. And by a unanimous vote, 9-0, the Supreme Court upheld that against the challenge from Gordon Hirabayashi that it was a violation of due process and equal protection to single out people of Japanese ancestry for a curfew when we were at war with Germany and Italy as well. In order to sustain the curfew in the courts, the government had to come in with a compelling story about the danger that Japanese Americans posed or were alleged to pose to the West Coast. And we normally think of this as being a sort of one inseparable idea, that Japanese Americans posed a risk. But it was actually, there were two pieces to this that the government needed to persuade the court to believe. One of them was about the external threat to the United States that the Japanese military posed, and the other was about the internal threat that Japanese Americans in the United States posed corresponding to the external threat. So there were two ideas. Japan posed a threat from outside, and Japanese Americans posed a threat from within. The internal threat, there we go. The internal threat, the idea that Japanese Americans posed a security risk, that has been undone. It is now understood, largely due to the work of chiefly Japanese American lawyers in the early 1980s. Some of you, many of you are surely familiar with the coram nobis cases, in which Fred Korematsu and Gordon Hirabayashi and Min Yasui were able to have their convictions wiped away, I guess I would just say, on the strength of proof that the government was misrepresenting to the courts the nature of the internal threat. It's a fairly well-known story, but the government was proven to have suppressed evidence and omitted key evidence that undermined the government's own claim to the courts that Japanese Americans posed a security threat. So that story is well known. That's the story of the coram nobis cases, the undoing or the proof of the lies relating to the supposed threat that Japanese Americans posed in the United States. What was the external threat that the government came into the courts telling, narrating? That's very clear. The government came into the court with a specific story, a highly specific story about the external threat posed by Japan, and that was the threat of invasion. When you go back and you read the government's submissions to the courts, that word appears again and again and again. The idea that they were seeking to create was that the curfew was part of a plan, a larger military plan to protect the coast against a threatened invasion. And I actually want to walk you through, this is going to be a little tedious, but it's really important for you to see how central the word invasion was to the government's story. So these are going to be excerpts from the government's brief in Hirabayashi versus United States. This is the government's submission in 1943. It was of the utmost military importance to prepare against an invasion of the Pacific coast. Another quote from the brief. Whether any condition existed within the West Coast area which might obstruct its successful defense in the event of an attempted invasion. The government talked about the military being faced with the responsibility of repelling a possible Japanese invasion, which might have threatened the very integrity of our nation. What was needed was a method of removing at once the unknown number of Japanese persons who might assist a Japanese invasion. The government talked in its brief to the courts about the ties of kinship or other intangible forces which might bind him to the members of an invading Japanese army. The government talked about what might spell the difference between the success or failure of any attempted invasion. And then, making it most clear, this quote, which simply and baldly asserts that the principal danger the West Coast was facing was a Japanese invasion. That was all from the government's brief. That's the story. That's the claim. The court bought it, accepted the bait that had been tossed in the water. These are excerpts from the Supreme Court's decision in Hirabayashi versus United States. The court spoke of the program being necessary to meet the threat of sabotage and espionage that would substantially affect the war effort and might reasonably be expected to aid a threatened enemy invasion. Over on the right, we cannot close our eyes to the fact, demonstrated by experience, that in time of war, residents having ethnic affiliations with an invading enemy may be a greater source of danger than those of a different ancestry. And then down here on the left, that reasonably prudent men charged with the responsibility of our national defense had ample ground for concluding that they must face the danger of invasion, take measures against it, and in making the choice of measures, consider our internal situation. Notice the distinction between internal and external cannot be doubted. Justice Douglas filed a concurrence in the Hirabayashi case that was even more straight up. He said, the threat of Japanese invasion of the West Coast was not fanciful, but real. So the government's allegations about the external threat became the animating idea of the Supreme Court's opinion in Hirabayashi, and it mattered. This is a point that I want to take a moment to emphasize. The acceptance of the invasion theory was quite literally the analytical linchpin of the court's analysis. The court articulated a legal principle in its opinion. Distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are by their very nature odious to a free people whose institutions are founded upon the doctrine of equality. The court followed that a sentence later by saying, ordinarily, in ordinary times, distinctions based on race or ethnicity would be a violation of equal protection. We may assume that these considerations would be controlling here were it not for the fact that the danger of espionage and sabotage in time of war and of threatened invasion calls upon the military to scrutinize everyone, right? So this idea that the curfew was part of a larger package of preparations against a threatened invasion was central to the court's conclusion and its disengagement of the idea of equal protection in Hirabayashi versus United States. I want to now take a few minutes and walk you through the actual evidence of what the military was preparing for and expecting at that time. This is a note to George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. And I want you to notice the date. It's a little bit faded out there. 20th February, 1942. Why is that a significant date, do you think? What happened on February 19th, 1942? Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. So this is quite literally contemporaneous with the signing of Executive Order 9066. what was happening is the Canadians and the British were trying to figure out what sort of defense they should be mounting for their part of the west coast of North America. And they wrote to George Marshall saying, the question of the scale of attack on the west coast has been raised by the Chief of General Staff in Ottawa. The conclusion that the British Chiefs of Staff have reached was as follows. So long as the United States maintain a battle fleet in the Pacific, large-scale seaborne expeditions against the western seaboard of North America and the employment of capital ship forces in this area are considered impracticable. In view of the great distances over which these operations would have to be undertaken, it's probably not necessary to provide a strong scale of defense, except at selected points of great importance. Then, this is the last bit, basically they say, we'd like to know whether you guys south of the Canadian-American border agree with the British assessment. And a fellow named Dwight Eisenhower, whom you may have heard of, responds on behalf of his boss, George Marshall, who has stepped away and is unable to respond directly. On February 20th, Eisenhower relays the message to the British, I am in concurrence with the conclusions of the British Chiefs of Staff with reference to the Japanese threat to the West Coast. This, I spent some time going through the various intelligence assessments that G2, the Army's intelligence division, was preparing at the time of the Japanese threat to the West Coast. Just to summarize this, they basically say there's going to be a lot of stuff going on in the Western Pacific. But here along the East Coast, along the West Coast of the United States, maybe we can expect some little sporadic things, but that's it. Interestingly, the projection of the risk to Hawaii in January of 1942 was to expect air and naval raids on outlying islands, harassing air and naval raids on Oahu, and maybe an effort to seize one of the large undefended islands for future use as a base for an attack on the fortress of Oahu. So they weren't even preparing for an invasion of Hawaii at that time, according to military, or they weren't projecting that. Think about then what might have been expected 2,500 or so miles further east on the west coast of the United States. John DeWitt at the Presidio was nonetheless a kind of nervous fellow, and he kept asking for more. He wanted more troops. He wanted more stuff to defend the West Coast, and he made those requests up the chain. And up the chain, they basically told him he was nuts. They told him that if we were to send you stuff, a large proportion of the troops in the continental U.S. would be devoted to defending against very little or nothing. Congress knew that the West Coast was not facing a threat of invasion. On February 4th of 42, a group of West Coast senators and congressmen got together for hearings in which they called in Army and Navy top officials to tell them about the threat facing the West Coast. It was the view of Admiral Stark and also of General Clark that an invasion effort was out of the question, that it was not expected by the military or naval administration. That's February 4th of 1942. Justice Department lawyers knew that that was what the military was telling Congress. How do we know this? Because they were there. The following day, there was another hearing from essentially the same group of congressmen and senators, not so much about the external threat, but about the internal threat. And at that event, Congressman Welch pointed out that he had asked the Army and Navy if there was any possibility of a raid on the West Coast, and they had replied negatively. Edward Ennis, a top Justice Department lawyer, was in the room that day. And we know this because some months later, he was interviewed by a researcher from the Japanese Evacuation and Resettlement Study who asked Ennis about what had happened. And Ennis explained that the congressman in the hearing room just told the Navy representative to go to hell, and that Stark didn't know what he was talking about. They said, look at Pearl Harbor, we don't want that to happen again in Los Angeles. The point is not that. The point is that Ed Ennis was in the room and knew that this is what top Army and Navy officials had told Congress, that there was an effort, that an invasion effort was out of the question. This was a year or months before the government would tell the Supreme Court that the principal danger to be apprehended was a Japanese invasion. So the Hirabayashi decision was based on a Justice Department lie, an additional lie beyond the one that we already knew about the internal threat. They were also lying about the external threat that the government was facing. This matters today because, first of all, the court has not formally overruled Hirabayashi against the United States. People think that it has because a few years ago, the Supreme Court, in a roundabout way, finally announced that Korematsu versus United States had been overruled. But they didn't mention Hirabayashi. They didn't mention it at all. So Hirabayashi, certainly as a technical matter, is still out there and has not been formally overruled. So I think it's important that it be overruled. And this new evidence, I think, is a good reason to do it. But much more importantly, the government is at it again. Right now, the government is invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to arrest, and it intends to deport Venezuelans who are members of alleged members of a gang. In order to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, and this is it here, that whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion, the government can do things to this group of enemy aliens. There's no declared war with Venezuela. So the entire invocation of the Alien Enemies Act hinges on the government's allegation, surprise, that the Venezuelan gang members are staging an invasion of the United States. It all hinges on that word in the statute. So this is where I end. The government lied about an invasion in 1942 and 1943. The government is back in the courts telling judges about the threat or the existence of an invasion. I'll end by noting that the case that is likeliest to go to the Supreme Court on this question is one that's pending in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which includes Texas. And I have filed an amicus curiae brief in that case, which is going to be heard at the end of this month, documenting these lies from the 1940s in order to try to encourage the courts not to fall for it a second time. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you both so much. I was really blown away by both of your talks. I just wanted to share a couple of brief reflections. First off, I'm glad that both of you talked a little bit about the entire West Coast, right? And this idea of what is it like in Canada, what is it like in Central America, and thinking through some of the extrajudicial renditions, kidnapping of Latin Americans that then take place. It sort of expands what the supposed threat was, and it also kind of links it to some of the ideas that were being purported in that era of the late 1930s, right? Thinking through the supposed espionage that's happening in the Panama Canal Zone that was referenced in the Ken magazine articles that I shared. But then also, Eric, when your use of the word invasion, I couldn't help but think how spot on it was, right? Because as early as like this idea of like the quote unquote yellow hordes of the Chinese invasion, later the peaceful invasion of Japanese according to the Native Sons of the Golden West. And it's important to note that, you know, the Native Sons were still active, right? In California in the 1940s, I've yet to find any evidence that DeWitt himself was a member, but he uses language, right? We saw a 1922 newspaper that said, "A Jap's a Jap," and that is the quote that is most likely attributed to General DeWitt when he's talking in the Tolan Committee, right? So it's like there's different elements that I think are pretty much throughout. And then there was one brief point of information I wanted to share, which none of us really touched on, the economic reasons for the incarceration, right, and the forced removal, which I think is always important. And I'm sure this is probably widely known by people here, but the average value per acre of West Coast farmland was about $37.94. So owned by farmers of any race or ethnicity in the entirety of the West Coast. The average Japanese American owned farmland was valued at $279.96 per acre. It's not because they had better farmland, it's because they were using tiered farming techniques, things that the Issei farmers had brought with them from Japan. They were given low soil grade land to grow on, rocky, sandy dirt, sometimes on a hill. But these were the lands that people are used to farming in Japan. So if they were involved in agriculture before they immigrated, they could use the same techniques that they were using in Japan and get the most value out of that acreage. But from the perspective of the white farmers, and particularly the white nativists in California and the folks who have been like buying this narrative hook, line, and sinker, it was this idea that there is this invasion and people are coming here not just to take our jobs, but to take our livelihoods and to extract the resources and send them back to Japan. So that was just another point that I wanted to share briefly. But again, thank you so much, both of you, for those compelling introductions to these topics. And look forward to hearing any thoughts that you all have about these works together.
Is it on?
Yep.
Yeah, you hear me? I actually have a question for you guys, and I think it works equally well for both of you. And the goal of the question is to see how we can incorporate maybe a slightly broader view of particularly of the 1930s. You both gave very, very compelling and accurate accounts of the depth of anti-Asian generally and anti-Japanese specifically racism that was pervading the public at that time, pervading the military and political leaders as well. Greg, I think you tell a very compelling story about, sort of the near inevitability, or at least the fertile ground that had been plowed to prepare for. But I also think about the 1930s as a time when, at least for some in the Nisei generation, there was a period, there was a trend of some success, even entering some of the kind of theretofore white, privileged, and controlled spaces, like the professions, for example. Mo Yonemura can become the president of the student body and the head Yell leader at UCLA just before war breaks out in 1941. So I'm curious how you think about that story in the 1930s, the kind of halting success of sorts of assimilation alongside the stories that you're very compellingly telling.
Yeah.
Well, I think that things can go south very easily, even when there's partial success. Like you think about African Americans in the generation after the Civil War, as C. Vann Woodward talks about in The Strange Career of Jim Crow, there was an odd space for African Americans to succeed. And there were various, like Robert Church in Memphis, who became millionaires, and black economic prospects were uncertain at best nationwide, but there were various stories of success. And then the Jim Crow era starts in the economic crisis of the 1890s, and all of a sudden there are daily lynchings. There are African Americans being deprived of voting rights everywhere through the South. So I think that that kind of success was partial and vulnerable. When there was a researcher who was claiming that mass removal was justified because until the the Roberts Commission reported that there was spying in Hawaii by Japanese Americans, that nobody on the West Coast was really anti-Japanese, a certain professor at University of North Carolina. And but he pointed out that the Japanese American press had listed that 20% of all of the land in Los Angeles was now open to population, to residents by Japanese Americans. By some strange coincidence, that means that 80% of the land was still closed to Japanese Americans. So I think that, again, the progress that was made was real, and especially outside of the West Coast. The assimilation of Japanese Americans outside of that region was quite striking. But the point being that it was contested, it was fragile, it was spotty. You know, in New Orleans, where there were about 75 Japanese Americans, there were 2 sisters who taught in the public schools, in white schools. There was not a single Japanese American teacher in public schools in California. That's the kind of real daily prejudice that Japanese Americans face.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eric. And I think, you know, Greg, you really gave a great answer for that. Some of the things that I was thinking about, how fragile acceptance is, right? It's this sort of like tacit acceptance or assimilation until it's no longer convenient. And I think that oftentimes Asian Americans, Japanese Americans specifically, have been kind of put into this sort of model minority, sort of middleman minority position where we have a certain proximity to whiteness until it's no longer politically acceptable. And then something happens, I think scapegoating, right? When we look at something as recent as the COVID-19 pandemic, how many Chinese Americans who had been 3rd or 4th generation business owners even in the East Coast, like in New York or in Philadelphia, they're facing anti-Asian hate crimes because people are linking them to this perceived threat from overseas. One of the other things I think about is how quickly enemies become friends and friends become enemies. I mean, just looking at Chinese and Japanese, you know, the Chinese were the villains, so then they start bringing in Japanese immigrants following the Exclusion Act, and then quickly Japanese become vilified again. But then Chinese become the allies, right, in the war against Japan. And we have volunteers who are enlisting to join the Flying Tigers to fly bombing missions against Imperial Japan on behalf of the Chinese nationals. And, you know, then, of course, you know, we're allies with China through World War II. But then, hey, the Communist Revolution in 1949, and suddenly China becomes the bad guy again. Post-war occupation, Japan becomes the good guy. And then we get to the US-Japan trade war of the 1970s and 80s. So it's like, it keeps flip-flopping, right? And we kind of see that we have been accepted in certain ways. And I think the 30s is an interesting tell because you see people really excel in particular ways. But I'll just share a brief anecdote. My great-grandfather was at Issei. His youngest brother was born in California, Kenji Matsumoto. He was a UCLA track and field star throughout the 1930s, early 30s. He was about to go to the Olympics. He was higher ranked in his sports than any of the athletes who did end up competing from his class, but because he was Japanese, he was not allowed to, even though he was a Nisei. So it's like we have a certain like ceiling, right? That people might call it the bamboo ceiling today in a more corporate environment, but I think that always existed. There's only a certain level of achievement that people are safely allowed to achieve before the sort of inherent white supremacist structure pulls people down.
Hi, so Jennifer Ho. Thank you so much for your presentations. And my question is about flipping what you've each presented, because I am so anxious about the present moment and the fact that people outside of this room don't know U.S. history. And I guess if you go to a national park, you can't learn actual accurate U.S. history. So, you know, Greg, I was struck by, you know, and this is part of the mythology, right? We put Japanese American people in camps for their own good because hordes of white people who are too racist to control themselves were going to kill Japanese Americans, which, by the way, is so insulting. If you're a white person, aren't you insulted by that? So I guess my question is about anti-racism, right? Because it's not to take away from the clear white supremacy and anti-Japanese, anti-Asian racism that each of you have spoken about, but particularly when we think about the lessons to take away from incarceration, leading up to incarceration, the aftermath of incarceration, and then the moment we find ourselves in now. What can you share in your own work related to the anti-racism efforts that you saw, maybe few and far between? I guess I'm thinking Quakers, right? I'm thinking about the state of Colorado. The governor there actually did stand up and tried to support Japanese Americans. And so what lessons can we learn from a period of history when there was so much virulent anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism to take with us so that we can support particularly Latin American communities who are just being targeted by ICE in ways that are so appalling?
I think that a very important lesson to learn from the experience of Japanese Americans is the involvement of Black Americans in anti-racist activities. I know that Chizu mentioned Thurgood Marshall, but during 1942, there were a disproportionate number of African Americans who stood up against Executive Order 9066. In California, Hugh Macbeth, who was a Black lawyer in Los Angeles, who was the head of the California Race Relations Commission, waged a single-handed war against Executive Order 9066. He even went to Washington to try and talk President Roosevelt out of it. He gave lots of information to Norman Thomas, the Socialist Party leader, was the only national political figure to stand up against Executive Order 9066. There were columnists like Langston Hughes, George Schuyler, Erna B. Harris. The Los Angeles Tribune, the Black newspaper, was the only West Coast newspaper to stand against Executive Order 9066. And there were various Black activists who wrote to the government or made protests or showed their help. So when the Native Sons of the Golden West brought the case of Reagan versus King to try and strip Japanese Americans of voting rights, Hugh Macbeth recruited Thomas Griffith, the head of the Los Angeles NAACP, and they wrote a brief, part of the JACL brief, The Negro's Interest in This Litigation, talking about the potential danger to other groups if Japanese Americans were stripped of voting rights on racial grounds. So that led to a longstanding alliance between the JACL and the NAACP, which lasted up to Brown versus Board of Education and beyond. It was limited, it was uncertain. As Japanese Americans came back to the West Coast or moved into communities outside of the West Coast, they had lots of Black neighbors, and that also helped coalitions, but they remained uncertain. Nonetheless, it shows the value of different kinds of interracial coalitions. And I think that that's an important lesson to learn for now, that people who have suffered racism will not necessarily join with others. It's too easy and convenient to think that victims of racism will naturally band together in a white supremacist country. But nonetheless, the experience and the commonality of treatment will foster solidarity.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for that really interesting question. And I think it's important, as you mentioned, to kind of reframe it and think a little bit about like what are the actionable lessons that we can kind of take away from this. Since my presentation was mainly focused on anti-Asian propaganda and racial ephemera, I think that part of it is being able to counter those with positive narratives, right? And I think so many folks have done that work. We have Don Young in the house from Center of Asian American Media and some other great Asian American filmmakers here that are doing that work, that are creating those counter narratives. And I mean, we just lost Bob Nakamura over the last weekend, one of the godfathers of the Asian American film movement, graduate of the first class from UCLA Ethnocommunications. I mean, they've been doing this work since the late 60s and early 70s to create these kinds of positive narratives. So it's like, it's not enough just to counter it. I think there's a need to also disprove it, which is becoming increasingly difficult in political discourse that's shaped by generative AI. And now we're in an environment where you can't even trust your own eyes in some cases. I think a decade ago when I started collecting ephemera, it was easy to bring like a piece of paper from the 1870s and show that to someone in person. But if you're just looking at an image of that online, someone could easily say, oh, that's just AI generated. Like, what are you talking about? This never happened. So I think that's a real threat. But at the same time, maybe one other thought to share. I'll be talking on some of these topics in the resettlement panel that's tomorrow. But outside of the West Coast, there's a lot of allyship. We know the Quakers, of course. I'm from Philadelphia. That's where we see the American Friends Service Committee and some incredible activism to try and stop the incarceration from happening and then try to make the conditions better and then aiding in the resettlement of the Japanese Americans during the war and post-war eras. And then I think Greg also bringing in the conversation around the black allies in the African American communities. The Philadelphia Tribune also published similar editorials that were decrying the racism of this policy. We saw these kinds of alliances in some of the historical black colleges and universities. So these are proven grounds, I think, fertile grounds to explore today and how we can have those linkages among historically marginalized communities. And then the last thing that I'll plug, there's a new project by a couple of Philadelphia JACL members called Our Debt of Gratitude. They're trying to collect stories of allies who helped people during and after the war in resettlement. So I know there's some flyers floating around at a couple of the tables here if folks want to learn more about that. But our family was helped by the Mormons in Utah. My great-grandparents and my Bachan and their siblings fled California during the so-called voluntary evacuation. And they were put up by Mormons who allowed them to live on their land and provided them a place to stay until they had enough funds to build their own house. So there's stories like that out there, and I think it's a question and maybe a challenge to all of us. What more can we be doing in this time?
Those were outstanding answers, and I really don't have anything unique to add, so I think we should just move along to the next question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for all your wonderful presentations. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. But I appreciated, Professor Muller, how you talked about the Hirabayashi case, and it's not an 80-year-old story. It resonates today. And you also talked about the repudiation of Korematsu. That's in Trump v. Hawaii. I think that's a response to Sotomayor's dissent, right? And that's kind of confusing to me, that whole situation with Trump v. Hawaii, where I believe in Sotomayor's dissent, she brings up Korematsu, and she talks about how, and again, my memory's kind of fading on that whole issue, but I thought she had talked about how that this government is treating a group monolithically, and that they're bringing up a national security reason why we should have this travel ban. And if I remember correctly, the opinion of the court just ignored what she had said, and that's when they repudiated the decision. So could you explain to me why in Trump v. Hawaii they basically ignored Sotomayor's dissent, and explain that to me, please.
Sure. So Trump versus Hawaii from 2018, I believe, when the Supreme Court decided it, was the Supreme Court's opinion on the so-called travel ban that at the very beginning of the first Trump administration, Trump ordered. You'll recall that travel ban was a list of initially just Muslim-majority countries from which all immigration was paused. The stated reason was that the on-the-ground vetting abilities in these listed countries to vet people who were wanting to come to the United States were so subpar that we couldn't trust anyone coming in from those countries, and so we needed to pause it indefinitely. And that was challenged in court. It was challenged in court on the basis that it was among other things, that it was singling out Muslim-majority countries and therefore was a violation both of the religion clause, the Establishment Clause of the United States Constitution, and also a violation of the equal protection rights of individuals, Muslim individuals who would be coming from those countries. The initial reaction in the courts was very negative to the travel bans. Courts began striking them down. So the Trump administration lawyers got clever, and they decided they would add a few countries to the list to make it not just Muslim-majority countries. So they added Venezuela to the list. They added, all of the many people seeking to come to the United States from North Korea were added to the list. And then the government came back into court and said, what do you mean this is anti-Muslim? It's not, first of all, there's lots and lots of Muslim majority countries that are not on the list. Secondly, if you look at this new list, you'll see that it's not just Muslim majority countries. So this is a neutral order. This is a neutral order. And when courts deal with neutral things, they use a much less demanding level of analysis and scrutiny than they do when they're looking at something like Korematsu or Hirabayashi, which were on their face singling out just people of Japanese ancestry. So the reason the Supreme Court gives for not accepting Justice Sotomayor's assertion that this is just the kind of discrimination practiced against Japanese Americans all over again is they say, what discrimination? That this is neutral. This isn't singling out Muslims. This is singling out certain countries where we have concerns about the on-the-ground vetting techniques. What do you know? It so happens that most of the countries on the list are Muslim-majority countries, but not all of them. So we don't have to even go down, Justice Sotomayor, we don't even know what you're talking about. You're talking about action singling out Japanese Americans. The order before us today doesn't single out anybody on the basis of religion or ancestry or anything else. That's why they're able to just ignore, I think, the very cogent point that Justice Sotomayor makes, that what the government was really doing with the travel ban was singling out Muslims and was therefore quite analogous to the singling out of Japanese Americans in 1942. I hope that was clear. I don't know if it was.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think Sotomayor makes that dissent after it was the final revision where they added these additional countries. And I always wondered if it was also the Supreme Court's adherence to executive power, too, that the president can do anything he wants based on, national security reasons.
Yes, combined with the fact that this was something that was about immigration. And there is a long body of law that says that the court's power to second guess decisions about immigration is very minimal. So I think it was not just national security, it was also that it was an immigration context where the president's power is usually by courts treated as quite nearly all-encompassing.
It's worth remembering that in the Korematsu case itself, and by the way, I should mention that we're graced by the presence of Karen Korematsu, Korematsu's daughter, that even in the Korematsu case, it was the dissent of Justice Murphy about it being racism that led Justice Black, writing for the majority, to say that no, this is not racism. We're not targeting Japanese. We're targeting people who are descended from Japan because we're at war with Japan, and that led to the Supreme Court's doctrine of strict scrutiny about the fact erecting a higher bar against laws and actions that made a racial classification. So it was in response to a dissent, in fact, that the court actually established this doctrine.
Thank you. I have a sort of follow-up question. Rosalind Tonai, National Japanese American Historical Society. We have an museum and the Presidio, MIS Museum. But so it's more of an interpretation question. Is that, so when Justice Roberts said that Korematsu was wrong and it has been overruled in the court of history, but is the court of history really the same thing that applies? Because when we tell kids and folks that visit, we say that it's still on the books. And so you should really dig into this and be aware of this. And what, how should we begin to do the interpretation when we have sort of a split Supreme Court, and things could change and not be in people's favor, particularly the issue of the Venezuelan migrants.
So what Chief Justice Roberts said in Trump versus Hawaii is that Korematsu was wrong when it was decided. It has been overruled in the court of history. We don't usually think of things being overruled in courts of history. We usually think of things being overruled in actual courts. There are some who argue that what Chief Justice Roberts said was what we lawyers call dictum, which is a Latin term that basically means not actually binding law because it wasn't necessary to say in order to resolve the case. Many people do, there are plenty of folks, Karen among them, who are very much of the view that that was not enough, it was not a clear enough repudiation, and it doesn't have the force of law. I know that Karen wants to say something, so I'm going to I'll say that I think that it would take a pretty gutsy future Supreme Court to go back on Chief Justice Roberts' words, and this is why I emphasize the Hirabayashi case. Because even if Korematsu was overruled, they nowhere mention Hirabayashi, and the Hirabayashi case was about a lesser restriction than was imposed on Fred Korematsu. It was, quote unquote, just a curfew. So I could imagine a future Justice Department lawyer saying, oh yes, Korematsu was overruled, but we should revive Hirabayashi because it was about a much smaller imposition on Japanese Americans than the one that Fred Korematsu endured. And I'll now turn it over to my friend Karen Korematsu.
I just got to a certain point and I go, well, that's it. So I just want to tell you the backstory so that you know, since we're all family here. I met Justice Sotomayor after the fact. I mean, I meet a lot of Supreme Court justices that I care to know and not know. The point being is also in Trump versus Hawaii that Holly Yasui and Jay Hirabayashi and I submitted an amicus brief. And especially since now Trump is talking about bringing back this travel ban, it's relevant today because we wanted to remind the courts, and this is with the Quorum Nobis team, all these attorneys got together, and we all got together to say, we have to submit this amicus brief, this Friends of the Court brief, and we wanted to remind the court at that time, my father's case of Korematsu versus United States was still on the record, even though his federal conviction had been overturned or vacated, right? So that was he had a federal criminal record for almost 40 years. That's what people don't know, and that's why we do this for education, Rosalind and I and others in this room. And also we wanted to remind the courts of the danger of overreaching of power. This is something we can all talk about now, right? Because that's what's happening. And this is the reality of why this history keeps being, repeated. But also because Justice Sotomayor, when she wrote her dissenting opinion, and she did it in a way that she went for the jugular. She knew, they all talk about these kinds of, the Supreme Court justices get together and talk about stuff, and and their decisions. But she was angry, and that's why she wrote the dissenting opinion that she did, and that's the only reason why Justice Roberts commented in his overreaching of power, which Eric was saying is dicta, and that was his opinion. So whether or not there would be another Supreme Court case, and it'd have to be a Supreme Court case, it's pretty powerful, that they could cite, again, Korematsu. It's a possibility. I mean, there's that gray, from my understanding, that gray, area. But I'm glad you brought up Hirabayashi. Also because, you know, Minya Sui's, you didn't talk about him as well, because that was not really kind of fully, you know, realized. But, you know, these Supreme Court cases are, you know, fortunately or unfortunately more relevant today just because of where we are in the courts. Thank you, sorry.
Thanks for that, Karen.
Okay, quickly, we have a pair of questions about the Alien Enemies Act. So this might be a very simplistic question, but how does the word invasion get interrogated and unpacked in the court of law in this instance? I don't really get it.
Well, there's sort of two components to that. One of them is, how would a court go about figuring out what the word invasion in the law actually means? And there's, you know, centuries worth of law that tell courts what rules to follow to unpack the meaning of words in statutes. So they will look at contemporaneous evidence from the 1790s about what the word invasion actually meant back then. That's called originalism, which some of you may be familiar with, is very much in vogue in the courts these days. They'll look at whatever evidence they can find about what the framers of that law in 1798 meant the word to mean and what it had been understood to mean. So that's the question about what the word invasion means. But there's a separate question about whatever the word invasion means. Has the government come forward with actual evidence of people doing things that would satisfy that legal definition? And that's the spot where they're doing the same thing over again, because they're coming into court and saying, trust us. We've got evidence that there's very, very bad invading people coming in. We can't tell you what it is because it's highly classified, which is exactly what the government did in Hirabayashi and in Korematsu. They invited the courts to use a doctrine called judicial notice, which is a way of saying, we can't actually supply any actual evidence, but courts, you can take account of what everybody knows. And everybody knows that the West Coast is facing an invasion. Like everybody, like, look, we know that. There was a refinery got shelled by a Japanese submarine. We know. So you can take account of publicly known things, but you can't ask us for details. And that's exactly what they're doing again. They're saying, there's an invasion, trust us, but we can't tell you the details because it's highly nationally security classified. That's the thing that I'm trying, in my amicus curiae brief, that I'm trying to get the courts not to do. Basically, the theme of that brief is, and I always get this expression wrong, fool me once, shame on you, fool me once, twice, shame on me. Don't be fooled again. They're coming in and doing the same thing that they did 80 years ago.
Do I have time for a quick question? Okay, is there a way that the Congress can, I mean, I've been out on demonstrations, you know, the last demonstration, I've joined the 5 million people who are demonstrating against what this administration is doing. But can the Congress overrule some of these these rulings? I mean,
well, I mean, Congress would
Alien Act, for example?
The Alien Enemies Act is an act of Congress. So Congress, if it wanted to, could repeal the Alien Enemies Act. It could amend the Alien Enemies Act.
Right.
I don't expect this Congress to do anything of that kind because they're not doing anything of any kind right now.
Right.
But yes, in the future,
theoretically,
presumably, the Alien Enemies Act could be completely withdrawn or it could be amended.
And could the Supreme Court be expanded easily?
The numbers of
The numbers of Supreme Court justices?
Easily? No.
No.
It's possible because the size of the Supreme Court is set by Congress.
Right.
But getting Congress to change the size of the Supreme Court would be...
Isn't it based on the judicial systems there are in the country? I mean, as the population has increased, there are more judicial.
If your question is, are there good arguments to support expanding the size of the Supreme Court?
Right.
Yes, there are good arguments for that. Are those arguments likely to win the day in the halls of Congress, especially this Congress? I think not.
Okay. Sorry, folks, time's up. I mean, it's fascinating, terrific stuff. I really feel we've had a tremendous discussion.